please welcome to the Museum of Flight, Eileen Bjorkman and Peggy Phillips.
Well, good afternoon. So you just saw that I'm retired from the Air Force. And when I was on active duty, and even now that I'm retired, a lot of times people ask me, did you go to the Air Force Academy? And I always say, no, I graduated from high school in 1974, and women were not allowed to go to the Air Force Academy until 1976. And older people will often say something like, oh, I'd forgotten about that. And younger people will often say something like, what? There was a time when women couldn't go to the Air Force Academy? And I say, yes, there was a time when women couldn't do a whole lot in the military. And that has all changed for the better. So before I get started on the history of the women in the 1970s who actually started flying in the military, I wanted to take you back 30 years and just do a couple slides about what happened for women in the military between World War II and the 1970s. So we'll just spend a few minutes on that. But I think it's good to have that background because they laid the foundation for what women that came in the 1970s and 1980s were able to do to get that door kicked open. So during World War II, there was a group of women called the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, Women Air Force Service Pilots, and they were a group of civilian women. There was about 1,000 of them eventually by the end of the war, and they were formed specifically to ferry aircraft around the country and to do other jobs that didn't require, combat-trained pilot. And the idea was to free up men in order to be able to go into the theater and to do those combat jobs. The women, it actually started out as two different groups of women, or two different groups that were led by, one was by Nancy Harkness Love, and one was by Jacqueline Cochran, who many of you may have heard of, a famous aviator at that time. And then in August of 1943, they merged into the group that became known as the WASP. They never did become actual members of the military. They were always just civilians. Later on, they did actually get veterans benefits. That's another story. I won't really be talking about that today. But they were disbanded as civilians and never did attain that military status. They were actually disbanded before the war ended, really because there was no need for them anymore. It was kind of a good news, bad news story. Good news because not as many pilots were being lost overseas. But bad news for the WASP because, like I said, they were no longer needed, and so they were all sent home. So after World War II, though, there were a number of women that were allowed to remain in the military because there actually were women. The WASP were civilians, but there were a large number, tens of thousands of women who came into the Army and the Navy and the Marines and the Coast Guard and served during the military as regular military members. So one of my aunts was actually one of those women. So, but the senior commanders during World War II were very impressed with the women. For one thing, they had to be 21 years old to join. So they tended to be a little bit older. They were more mature. They had a lot fewer behavioral problems, and they had to really be more qualified than the men in order to get in. So naturally, they were going to be very good troops. And so the senior leadership in the military said, hey, we'd really like to keep these women around, at least some of them, mostly just to form a basis for if they had to, had got into another big war, and they would have a basis to build on. So Congress passed a law and did allow the women to remain in the military. Originally, the law had said they were supposed to all get out within, I think, six months after the war ended. So they did pass a law and allowed a very small number of women to continue serving, but there was some significant limitations. For one thing, they put into law that women could not fly aircraft in combat, and they could not serve on combat ships. Now, the services took that one step further, and they said, well, women aren't going to fly at all. They're not going to serve on ships at all. But the basis for that prohibition on combat was actually put into law. There were other limitations, like I just mentioned, women couldn't fly by policy. They were also limited to 2% of the force, so again, very small numbers. The highest rank they could achieve was colonel. They were not allowed to be general officers. And they were kicked out if they became pregnant. And they were kicked out even if they got dependent children because they married, say, a widower who had some kids already. And they were not allowed to stay in because, oh, you have dependents now, even though they weren't even really their kids. So also, if they were married to a civilian, their husbands were not considered dependents, and they got no benefits for their husbands. Even though men, as soon as they would marry, their wife would automatically get benefits as a dependent. So, but women still served very honorably. A lot of women did want to serve. They served they were not allowed to serve in country in Korea unless they were nurses. But during Vietnam, eventually women were allowed to serve over in Vietnam, and things just gradually started getting better. In 1967, they lifted the grade restrictions and the 2% limit, and that allowed women to now become general officers. And in 1970, we saw the first, there were 2 women in the Army who were promoted to brigadier general, and the Air Force followed a year later. So also in 69, women had not been allowed to get commissions through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. The only way they could get a commission was to pay for their college first and then come into the Air Force or other service through some kind of officer training or officer candidate school. But in 1969, the Air Force opened ROTC to women as well. And, and then again, there were just gradually other restrictions that were lifted other than combat. Women were gradually started to allow to fly. The pregnancy restrictions eventually went away. The marriage rules, all of that kind of stuff. There was a lot of lawsuits that got filed and stuff. These women were mad. They wanted to get what was due to them. So by the time the 70s rolled around, women were starting to come into the military in larger numbers. And as they started coming into the military in larger numbers, the services started to realize that they needed to open more occupations to them. And the Navy was actually the first one to open aviation to women. They had an admiral, and my brain just went dead on his name, but they had an admiral who was very forward-thinking. Z. Grams, he would. And anyway, he was very forward-thinking, and he decided, hey, we're going to start training women as pilots. And so the Navy in 1973 brought in 6 women to become naval aviators. And in February of 1974, the woman depicted here, Lieutenant Junior Grade Barbara Rainey, became the first female naval aviator. So the Navy does things a little different than the Air Force. The Air Force, people go to pilot training, they all graduate on the same day. The Navy's just sort of, the Navy's like, okay, you're done. Here's your wings. Bye. So they can clearly say they had a first, whereas the Navy can, or the Air Force can just say we had 10 first. So the Army soon followed suit. It took the Air Force a little bit longer. I've always felt that the reason it took the Air Force longer was because the Air Force is the only service whose primary mission is to fly. And so I think it took them a little bit longer to admit that women could actually fly airplanes, so that they could, but they did finally open up to women in 1976. So there was also an important milestone in 1975. The Congress overruled the services and said, no, you are going to start letting women go to the service academies. It was too late by then for women to start attending in 75, but they did start attending in 1976. And that same year was when, so you got the women at the academy first, and then just a few months later, the 10 women that you see depicted at the bottom of the slide here were accepted into undergraduate pilot training. Initially, it was billed as an experiment. We're just going to see how these women do. We're not really sure, how this is all going to work out. But the women all did fine. The first class of 10 did fine. They all graduated and went on to fly various different kinds of aircraft that were not combat aircraft. They were allowed to fly tankers, airlifters. A couple of them were allowed to stay at pilot training and as instructors and fly the T-38 or the T-37 trainer. So, but for the most part, they went off and flew large airlifters and transport and tanker aircraft. So almost immediately, though, women started making their mark. Lieutenant Kathy Rambo, who was actually a reservist, was flying C-141s, and she flew an operation in 1978 over in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she received an Air Medal for her for her contributions to those flights over there. So it was kind of an interesting story. There were the people back, she was over in Germany when the crew that she was flying with went down to Zaire, and I guess the people in the United States didn't realize there was a woman on the crew, and she was actually flying over there for about a week before somebody went, "Hey, wait a minute, isn't that a combat zone? Is she supposed to be doing that?" And so they wound up having to come back, but they recognized her for her actions and did give her that first air medal. So now we start moving into the 1980s, and now the women are starting to think about, okay, we can't really do that much. This combat restriction is starting to limit our careers because it was starting to do things like, okay, you got somebody flying in a combat zone, is that in combat? So, and you started getting a lot of confusion about what was combat, what wasn't combat. And also the women were starting to recognize that they didn't, like I said, they didn't have much of a career path if they had this combat limitation on them. So now I want to turn to Peggy, because Peggy came in 1980, just as we were making this transition. I actually came in 1980 as well, and but wanted to have you talk a little bit about your experiences coming into the Air Force, and then maybe some of the early days of the women military aviators. So.
Okay. So, like Eileen has said, when I was going through high school and college, it really wasn't an option. My dad was in the Air Force when I was growing up, so I was familiar with active duty, but he was a security policeman, wasn't really keen on pilots or officers. They always caused problems. So, so I went through college. I graduated in 1976 as an elementary school teacher because that's what we did. We were secretaries, nurses, school teachers. I didn't have the great mentoring you had to become an engineer, and met a guy who was flying airplanes in the Air Force in New Jersey, and he told me about this new program. And I wasn't quite sure that that was for me, but I thought, okay, well, I'll filled out the paperwork, and at the time, I knew I didn't really want to go on active duty. I was already 24. Of course, the recruiter lost the paperwork 3 times. It was carbon paper. He had to redo it over and over. And I got the call in December of '79 that I'd been selected to go pilot training. Now, the path that I took was to go through the Air Force Reserves. The Air Force Reserves, you have the active duty, you have the reserves, and you have the Guard. The Guard is state funded. The reserves are federally funded, and then you have the active duty as well. In order for me to become a reservist, I had to go and interview with reserve units, and they would technically fund my education through pilot training. So you had to interview, get selected, and then go to pilot training. The training was all exactly the same as what the active duty was going through. So I started pilot training in January. You have to go through a small screening program. They want to make sure that you can fly the Air Force way, that you could solo in 12 hours, and then you go to become an officer because you're an officer first. Your job just happens to be a pilot. And then pilot training was a full year. And the other difference for my career versus the active duty was I knew what airplane I was going to fly because that reserve unit sponsored me. And at the time, it was a C-141 4-engine cargo airplane. On the active duty side, they had to go through the whole year of pilot training before they found out at the end what kind of an airplane they were going to fly. So I had a couple of differences in that regard, although my training was right along with the active duty, and I did all those things until I went back to my reserve unit. And I graduated in 81-05, so.
Okay, so. And then, and somewhere along that time, I think it was around 1982, was when the women started to form what became the Women Military Aviators. So, yeah.
Yes, there was a group of instructor pilots at Williams Air Force Base, and we would go through our classes, whereas you saw that picture with the 10 first women, so they had to go through their whole year before the Air Force would allow the next group of 10 to go through. And after those first 20, well, then they decided that we really were functional, and they would allow 2 or 3 women at a time to go through a class. And so we were all scattered. Like, there were only 3 women in my class. I was a reservist, so I went one place, the other gal went someplace else. So these three women at Williams Air Force Base thought, well, maybe we have similar issues, but because we're scattered, so they sent out a survey asking for women if they would be interested to try to get together. What kind of issues are you having where you're at? So the unbeknownst to these women, the WASPs that you had heard about were amazing women. We had this great mutual admiration society for each other because we were in awe of what these women had done. And I remember Sarah Hayden telling us that if you don't tell your story, no one else is going to tell it. And that was what the WASP had experienced. And because they had joined together, that's how they finally got veterans benefits in the late 70s. So these, the active duty gals, these three gals met with the WASP and they formed this organization. And at the time, it was called the Women Military Pilots Association. It didn't take very long before we realized that there were other career fields in aviation besides just pilots. So then we became the Women Military Aviators. And the first conference with the WASPs was held in 1983 in Indianapolis. And this amazing friendship began. And I could go on, but that's probably not what you want.
No, that's great. So, yeah. So, and you'll hear more about the women military aviators later. So, yeah. So you mentioned 1983. Something else happened in 1983. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. So first there was the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. And then just about a week later, there was the Grenada invasion. And C-141s, as a transport aircraft, played important roles in both of those operations. And I think you had a part in that as well, Peggy. Right?
I did, yes. So again, as reservist, you're always required, you have the same requirement to be current and proficient in the aircraft as the active duty. You're just not getting paid every day. You only get paid for the days you work. And so when Grenada kicked off, we didn't own our airplanes. We shared them with the active duty at McGuire Air Force Base. So I always say we're just fresh meat. So when they need more people, they call on us. So I did get to participate during that time frame. And this was the first time we had actually had any kind of international event since Vietnam. And so the VFW was really happy because now they had a whole group of people that could now become members because we had served in a foreign war. So there was a large number of awards and medals that were issued after that. I received one of those awards. Our crew was 5 or 6 people on a C-141. So we got our awards, and at some point, I got notification that our order, for no explanation, I don't have an explanation for it, my award was rescinded. And it was kind of like, well, that's pretty weird. And so it was given to me in February of '84. It was rescinded in May of '84. But then I had a great wing commander who said, okay, this doesn't make any sense. But it took until August of '86 for that award to get reinstated. And to this day, I don't exactly know why, but I have my suspicions.
Suspicions that it was because you were a woman and you weren't supposed to be in a combat zone, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and so you see another woman. You see this woman on in the picture here. Captain Margie Veruska, who's also a women military aviator. She was actually in the first class of women who graduated from the Air Force Academy. She was a C-141 pilot, and she flew down into Grenada, and she was given a medal. And she told me that yes, when she got back, there was some discussion about whether or not she was actually supposed to be on that flight, and so was she going to get that medal or not? Well, obviously they came through and gave her the medal, and it didn't get rescinded.
Right,
so
it didn't get rescinded.
Yeah. But the other thing I thought was interesting about this operation was that so all the women who were flying C-141s on the East Coast went to Grenada. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them went. But you had also C-141 squadrons on the West Coast, like at Norton Air Force Base at the time. And their wing commander said, no, we're pulling the women off of those airplanes. They are not allowed to go. That's a combat zone. And so you already were starting to see what I call cracks in the law there, because you had commanders, individual commanders, making decisions about what was combat and what wasn't. And so some women got to go, other women got pulled off the schedule, and men, who probably were expecting to have a day off, had to come in and fly. Now, I'm sure they didn't really mind because they got to go do some really cool flying, but you see how disruptive it is, especially because now you have people at the local level interpreting things that are really kind of having national level impact.
Right.
And so that was kind of the first crack that we saw. And then Libya was another operation, which so that was a raid in Libya in retaliation for some terrorist bombings that had happened. And it was F-111s and some Navy aircraft that were the striking aircraft. Now, obviously, women weren't flying in those striking aircraft, but that operation could not have been completed without a huge contingent of tanker aircraft. And there were 6 women flying on those tankers, and one of the main planners was a woman, Gail Wojtowicz. And so again, you had women who are now flying in operations that are bordering on combat, not flying downtown and dropping bombs, but they're getting very, very close to combat. And that operation, Gail told me when they were doing the planning, the colonel that was in charge of the planning, one of the first things he said was, women are flying on these missions. We are not pulling any women, the crews are going to stay together. We are not pulling any women off of the tanker crews.
Well, one of the things about tanker crews is they are a hard crew.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so if you were to break up a crew, now you're dispersing different people. In the 141, the crews could be mixed and matched. We didn't fly hard crews like where it was all defined who was on that crew. So for the tankers, for sure, it's very disruptive. If you train with a group of people and you're expecting to fly with those people, then all of a sudden to not have that person in the seat is quite disruptive.
Yeah. And then Panama, you had several women helicopter pilots who actually inserted troops again into the hostile area, coming under fire. And Captain Linda Bray, there's still some controversy about what she actually did. But she led a group of military police to take over a kennel, and it turned out that there was actually a lot of soldiers and actually led her troops into combat there. So now you have women again who are getting very close to combat. They're not supposed to be in combat because of the laws, but you're starting to see so much integration of women and so much dependency on the women that it's getting harder and harder to go to war without them. So. And then in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August. And that kicked off Desert Shield and then finally Desert Storm in January of 1991. And this was very much a logistics war. Those of you who are old enough to remember it, it was night and day aircraft flying nonstop over to the Middle East to take equipment over there, people over there. I mean, obviously there were all the combat aircraft that flew over there, but they had to have tankers to get them there. Women were flying the tankers, women were flying the transports. They were flying pretty much every kind of aircraft that you can imagine, and they were actually getting into the combat zone on occasions. They were coming under Scud attacks, all sorts of, like I said, basically in combat. And you, again, were part of that, right, Peggy?
I did have that opportunity, yes. So as I had told you earlier, we had to maintain proficiency and currency just like the active duty does. So when the reserves are called up on the reserve side of the house, you have 72 hours to walk out the door, be ready to insert yourself. And that includes the 12 hours prior to crew rest. So we got the call on a Friday, and on Monday we were reporting for duty. And you're right, it was all hours of the day and night. I was flying C-141 cargo airplanes at the time. At the time, I was married and I had 3 children. My children were 6, 4, and 16 months. And my husband was also in the squadron. And we had a pretty amazing squadron commander. As you might guess, this is going to make, sensational news. And so he asked my husband at the time, Do you guys want this information out? And you don't have to, so we didn't. And you don't want to take away from the real mission, that we were not the story, right? And so with the support of family and friends, and, our squadron commander said, because you would fly, you wouldn't, nowadays people deploy and they stay in theater, but we were flying everything from the US through Europe over into the desert. So he just basically said, one of you can be out of the country and one can work the scheduling desk. Now, if we weren't married, we wouldn't be double doing that job, but because we had that situation, at least it didn't give the perception that we were getting any special treatment because we were married with children, but we were basically working the desk or flying at the time.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, no, that worked out very well. So yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So I remember when you told me about that. So yeah, and I know a couple of other crews that were married at that time that a similar kind of thing happened. They had a kid and they were able to arrange it so that one of them was always home, with the
Right.
kids. So yeah. So. So like I mentioned, we had some. I'll show you a slide here in a second, but there were some women Army pilots who actually flew inside Iraq. And in total in the war, 13 women died, 21 were wounded, and 2 were taken POWs. So sounds like women are in combat to me. So yeah. So here's just some pictures from the war. So this is Stephanie Wells. She was a major at a time in a reserve unit. A lot of reservists. That was another thing. I think you wound up with a lot of women because a lot of women had joined the reserves or had gotten into the reserves after doing their active duty. And she was a C-5 pilot. She was actually working for NASA at the time and flying out of Kelly Air Force Base. And here's just a couple pictures of her, one with a load of bombs that she was taking over, and then a picture of her in the cockpit of the C-5 after the war, the shooting war started there in January. So. And then this is, I'm not going to try to brief this in any kind of detail, but this is just to show that you had your women Army helicopter pilots flying Chinooks. Again, lifting the 18th, I can never remember all the Army numbers, so the 18th Airborne Corps up into Iraq, and Captain Victoria Calhoun and then Major Marie Rossi were doing that, and Captain Calhoun got within about 90 miles of Baghdad, so she got pretty far into Iraq at one point. Unfortunately, Major Rossi was killed the day after hostilities ended. She was on a flight late at night, early in the morning, transporting some POWs, and they hit an unlighted aerial tower. And unfortunately, she was killed. So everybody came back from the war, and obviously it was a very successful operation, and the public realized that, hey, women are in combat. Women are over there doing stuff, and and because you had a lot of reservists that were in the war too, they didn't just see Johnny going off to war. They saw Susie going off to war too, and Peggy, and so they realized that, I think the public started to realize how much the military depended on women. They couldn't just leave them all home. They had to take them with them. And so Beverly Byron and Patricia Schroeder in the House of Representatives inserted some language into a House bill because they were just starting to deliberate the budget, the next year's defense authorization. They inserted some language to repeal the combat and exclusion law, and it just sailed through the House. So you can see it got passed by the House on May 22nd. So just a couple of months, 3 months after the war ended, and people were still coming back from the war at that point. And that just gobsmacked the services. They were like, what? And there were also opponents, obviously, of women going into combat. And so they started lobbying against women going into combat. And they got to the Senate, and the SASC voted against the Senate Armed Services Committee voted against that House language. And so there was going to be a bill in the Senate that was going to be voted on by the full Senate, and everybody was worried that now that they did not have the support in the Senate anymore that they needed. There actually were quite a few senators that were in favor of it, big names like Ted Kennedy. John McCain. But unfortunately, the lobbyists got to McCain, and he kind of started to wobble, and so there was some uncertainty.
Goldwater too, right?
Yeah, yeah. So there was a lot of uncertainty about whether it was actually going to pass or not. So, but then what happened on July 18th? I say that the opposition made a tactical error. So there was a woman, a reporter. Who from the Washington Times, she went down and flew with a pilot in an F-15 at Langley Air Force Base, which is not far. It's about 150 miles from the D.C. area. And so she flew in the back seat of this F-15, and when she came back, she wrote an article saying, well, I can understand why men don't want women flying these fighter airplanes. I mean, it was really hard, and I can understand now. I don't think women could do this. Never mind that she was inexperienced. She knew nothing about flying airplanes, and so she wrote this article, and it just, when women's aviators saw that, they were infuriated. And one woman who wasn't even an aviator was furious. Heather Wilson, some of you may have heard of her. She was a congresswoman from New Mexico for a few terms, and was also recently a former Secretary of the Air Force. She was an '82 graduate from the Air Force Academy, and she had gotten out of the Air Force and turned down pilot training because she knew she wouldn't be able to fly combat aircraft.
Oh, wow.
And so she was really mad when she saw this article. And that was when she called women military aviators, and she said, arm your Rolodexes. Now, for those of you, the young people in the crowd, that was sort of like your address book on your phone now, right? Except it was actually a physical thing that had people's names and phone numbers on little cards. So Carolyn Beecraft, who was formerly an Army officer who had to get out when she became pregnant back in the 60s, she was also very much in favor of working with the women and trying to get this thing across the finish line. And she called Rosemary Mariner, Kelly Hamilton, I can't remember which one, and said, get your women and come to Washington. So a bunch of women, I can't remember how many total they had, but quite a few women.
A dozen, I think.
Yeah, a couple dozen who could get away from take leave and come to Washington, or in a couple people's cases, they were airline pilots, and they were able to, have time off from the airline for a couple days and come up to Washington. And they got with, so Heather Wilson took a batch of them, Carolyn Beecraft took a batch of them. There was also National Organization of Women took a batch of them, and there might have been one more. But anyway, they took them around, and they educated the staffers about the limitations that were being placed on them because of the combat restriction law. And they weren't allowed to lobby because they were in uniform. They're in the military, and so they're not allowed to lobby. But Carolyn Beecraft and Heather Wilson and the others, they could lobby, and so they would be, hey, you really need to, to overturn this law, and it was effective. So the combat ban was finally lifted in 1993 in the fall. But they decided that they were going to have a study. They inserted some language into the bill, some of the opposition. Let's do a study. If you don't want to do something, you do a study. If you don't like the answer, you do another study, right? So yeah, and so anyway, so they did this study, and so I was just kind of wondering, you must have been aware that all of this was going on, and so I know you weren't one of the ones that actually went to the Hill to lobby, but you must have been aware. I mean, what did you think when you saw all this going on? So
well, for me, I was on the West Coast by that time. I had moved from New Jersey to Washington, and so we were kind of on the outskirts a bit, and honestly, it made perfect sense that we would be able to do that because I was already doing that. I mean, I'd already spent 20 hours on the ground during Desert Storm, and, at one point having to go under the shelters. And although I was not ever going to be able to be a combat pilot as far as a fighter goes, I mean, that was not something that was in my cards. But I knew that heavy airlift, we were the first ones in, and you're the last ones out. When those fighters show up, they want their maintenance, they want their breakfast, they want all those things. Well, the only way it's going to get there is if we took it there. And I totally enjoyed my mission because we were always flying the mission. we weren't always just practicing to fly the missions. We did evacuations, and if people needed to be evacuated for medical purposes, we were flying into those areas to get the patients to fly them back out again. So it really made no sense to have that differentiation that you couldn't fly combat. The reality was we were flying combat, we just couldn't shoot back because we didn't have any guns on board. That was really the only difference as far as we could tell. So, and there are women, just like there are men, that are highly capable and able to fly those high performance aircraft, and they should have every right to do it. Just because you're a girl shouldn't mean you can't do something.
Yes. So. Yeah. So, and there actually were some women in the Navy who were flying what they call tactical aircraft. They were only allowed to fly them to train male pilots. So, yeah.
Right, which is kind of what happened during World War II with the WASPs as well. So,
yeah. So anyway, so this is some of the women that went to lobby. So I'm not going to try to tell you who all they are, but you see it is a multi-service group of people. So a lot of Air Force, but also some Navy and at least one Army aviator in there as well. So like I said, these were the women that helped to make that final push through. So, but as I mentioned, Sam Nunn added that amendment to create this presidential commission. So yeah, and that was like, at first everybody's like, oh, they repealed the law. Now women are going to get to fly, and it's like, no, not quite, not so fast. We're gonna have a presidential commission, and it wasn't just to look at aircraft. It was kind of look at how we're using women. Should they be assigned to combat jobs and in general. And unfortunately, they met for about a year. So, and at the end of that year, in November of 1992, the commission, despite there being quite a few people on the commission actually who were supportive of letting women into combat, the commission overall recommended that flying in combat remain closed to women. So, but what else happened in November of 1992? Yes, Bill Clinton got elected. So yeah, and so the Clinton administration took over in January of '93, and one of the things that Clinton had campaigned on was that he was in favor of opening the door to combat. Now, it still took a while, 3 more months, but there's a whole story behind that too, but I won't go into all the gory details. So, but in April of 1993, Secretary of Defense at the time, Les Aspin, ordered the services to open combat aircraft to women. And the picture that you see here is of Merrill McPeak, who was the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, wearing a Navy-inspired uniform that didn't last very long. So, yeah.
It was his design.
Yeah. After he left, they quickly went back to the old way. So, yeah. But he was one of the most vocal opponents of women flying in combat aircraft. And he even said, I know that doesn't make any sense. I'd rather fly with a less qualified male than, I mean, it was kind of insane, some of the things that he said in public. But once Secretary Aspin ordered him to open combat aircraft to women, he wanted to lead the charge. And so he brought 3 women to that same press conference where they announced they were opening combat aircraft to women. He brought these 3 women and said, these are the first 3 women fighter pilots in the U.S.
Totally rolling over the Navy, who thought they were going to be first.
Yeah. The Navy beat us initially, but then we got them in the end. So yeah, and so you see there. Let's see. I'm trying to think. You're right to left. Anyway, the one right next to General McPeak is Jeannie Flynn at the time, later Leavitt. She went on to fly F-15Es, an air-to-air and air-to-ground aircraft. Sharon Presler is in the middle. She flew F-16s. And then Martha McSally, some of you may remember her as a congresswoman later in her life. She went on to fly A-10s. So, and you notice some of the body language there. they're definitely looking at him like, dude, you were like saying all the bad things in the world about us, and now you got us up here on stage. Yeah. But they all went on and had successful careers. Jeannie Leavitt just recently retired as a 2-star general. So Sharon retired as lieutenant colonel, had a successful career, and she's on the speaking circuit now. And Martha McSally was actually the first woman to fly a combat aircraft in combat. So she logged that first combat sortie in a combat aircraft. So just this past year, we're celebrating 30 years of women in combat aircraft. And at Oshkosh, a big air show that they have in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, every summer, we brought those 3 women back again. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, and had them up on stage, and you see there the picture on the left. I guess your left, yeah. You see them recreating their pose there. We didn't have General McPeak there, so
Darn the luck.
but we had them. And we had a whole panel, not just with them, but Jacqueline Van Ovost was there. She's a 4-star general. She was one of the women that was not allowed to fly in combat, but had a very successful career anyway, flying airlift aircraft and as a test pilot. And then we had some women who have benefited from the law. So women who were either current combat pilots or had recently retired from flying as combat pilots. And one of the things I learned at Oshkosh, well, there were 2 things I learned. First of all, the 3 of them, when they were at Oshkosh, that was the first time all 3 of them had been together again since that first picture was taken. So, because they just went their separate ways, and they didn't really, they kind of scattered and didn't really stay in touch with each other. And then the second thing I learned was that Jeannie Flynn, and I knew this part of it, I knew that when she was at pilot training, she wanted to ask for an F-15E, even though the law had changed, but the policy hadn't changed yet. And she asked for it, and it was going to kind of caused a little bit of a stink, but she was the #1 graduate in her pilot training class. And she said, up to that point, till she wanted to ask for the F-15E, all the instructors were like, oh, you're the best pilot we've ever flown with, you're amazing, you're awesome. And then once she said she was going to ask for the F-15E, they were like, oh, you're terrible, And then and the only instructor that backed her up was Martha McSally.
Right.
Yeah, she was an instructor at the same base, and Martha McSally was the only one that backed her up. So anyway, it was an incredible time, and
and she wanted to be on record for having to ask for that airplane because on the active duty side, you would ask for your choice aircraft, and she figured if I don't ask and they repeal the law, they'll come back and say, oh, well, you didn't ask for it. So she made sure that she asked for it at that time. Yeah,
she just wanted it on record. And I actually talked with the colonel, he also retired as 4-star general, who was running that process for the Air Force at the time. And he said that was not a surprise. He knew it was coming. Yeah. The wing commander, her wing commander had called him like the week before and said, hey, our #1 pilot's a woman and she's going to ask for an F-15E. And he's like, no. But it all worked out okay. So yeah. So I don't know if you had any final thoughts on what opening the door meant to you. Like I said,
I had a great career, and I'm really pleased, and I am super pleased that you have taken the initiative to document this and to get it into a book for people to be aware of the situation, because it's so it's so common now that if you don't record that piece of time, it was even when we were debating whether women should fly in combat in the early 90s, they had forgotten that Maria Rossi had died behind enemy lines within a year of her death. And it was like, well, you don't want women being POWs. Okay, we just did that. We've done that through every war. And so memories are short. So thank you, Eileen, for putting this in writing to document this for generations to come.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you to women military aviators for helping to write the story. So
there you go.
Thank you, everybody. We'll take your questions.
I have a couple of observations. when the Wasps were flying, I know they weren't allowed to fly in combat, but they'd make them towed targets. So they were subject to fire that way. I remember a story from one of the books I read. I don't know, it was a B-29, one of the big bombers, where they were having some pilots, the male pilots were worried about flying them. And so that this general brings these women out of the pilot and has them take off their helmets so their hair falls down. The other thing that makes me think about are the Tuskegee Airmen, who were not allowed to fly, but once they were allowed to fly, they were some of the most favored pilots in World War II.
Yes, that's correct. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels between the Tuskegee Airmen and the WASP and women flying in combat. So yeah, and one of the things I always, depending on the audience that I'm with, I also point out with the WASP is I think was it 39 that died? So 39. So about a 4% fatality rate. And they were a civilian organization. I don't know of any other volunteer civilian organization in the U.S. that had a 4% fatality rate during World War II. So these women were doing a dangerous job, and like you pointed out, in some cases they were actually being shot at. In theory they weren't supposed to be.
Their own people,
but they're but these are trainees that are shooting at them, right? So yeah, and so I mean, I think with a fatality rate that high, I mean that they definitely served their country, and they were in danger, doing a very dangerous job, even though they weren't in combat. So.
During your experiences being in the armed forces, did you have a lot of resistance in your personal world from the men when you were first starting out, or did you feel more supported, or what was that like personally in your sphere of working in the armed forces?
Well, for me, I was on a crew airplane, and I have to say that I had an immeasurable amount of support. They knew that you went through the same training, you did the same thing that they did, and you just depended on each other. And so as long as you held your end of the bargain, and did what you needed to do, every once in a while you'd run into one or two people who could be a jerk, but that happens in day-to-day life no matter what, right? And even when I was the squadron commander, we were activated in 03 to 05 in the C-17. I got the support that I needed. And I honestly think that part of it was, I made sure, and I think every woman for sure that I know, you show up prepared. They're going to notice if you're not prepared, right? Maybe more than somebody else might get more of a benefit, and not take yourself so seriously. In the very beginning, when you're going through all the second lieutenant harassments, you get chains in your helmet bag, or you get this, or you get that. It's all because I'm a second lieutenant. It has nothing to do because it's the fact I'm a woman. I'm the new kid on the block. And I think it's attitude and showing up prepared. And then you got the support that I needed.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think having a sense of humor is very essential in the military, no matter who you are. So I found the same thing. And I was in the test business. I was a flight test engineer. That's why I got to fly in the back of an F-4, was because it was considered a test airplane and not a combat airplane.
There
So
you go.
yeah, so I was very lucky to be able to do that back in the 80s before they lifted the combat exclusion law. So, but I always found that people in the test business and people on the engineering side of the house, I think they were more accepting of women. So I always felt accepted. I mean, like Peggy, there were some exceptions,
Right.
to that. There were some people that were jerks, and I would occasionally talk to some of the fighter pilots about, women flying in the, I'd say, hey, I can fly in the back seat of this thing. Why shouldn't women be in combat? And some of them were like, you're right. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't open it. And then other men were like, oh, well, it's different, and but one thing I found interesting was, one time I was talking to a guy about it, and he said, when I first came in the Air Force, I didn't think women should fly in combat aircraft. He said, but now I have a daughter, and I don't want her to have any limitations put on her. And if she grows up and wants to be a pilot, I want her to be able to fly any airplane out there. So I could already start to see that shift in attitude. So yeah, even before the law changed, yeah.
And how about those commanders or on the East Coast that allowed the females to fly on those missions even though you weren't supposed to be in combat? Did they ever face any consequences for doing that you know of?
I'm not aware that they did.
aware
No,
either.
I think they just said, hey, women are, they're part of our team. They're on the schedule. And that's what Margie explained to me. She was already on the schedule that day because they schedule like a couple weeks in advance, I think, and stuff, or a week advance. So
Yeah.
And she was already on the schedule that day, and the commander just said, no, I'm not pulling her off the schedule. She had a broken leg or something, yeah, but she's perfectly healthy. She's ready to go. She's on the schedule. Go. So yeah. So I think that, but that was part of the issue, right? Was that you had some commanders saying, no, they're on the schedule, send them, and other commanders going, no. So yeah. In fact, Victoria Calhoun, the Army pilot that flew into Iraq, she said, first of all, she was actually pulled off the schedule to go to Panama.
Okay.
Yeah, her unit deployed to Panama, and she was not allowed to go. And then when Desert Storm kicked off, her unit was one of the first ones to go over there, and she went to a meeting right when everything kicked off. They went to a big meeting. They had the battalion commander there, and the guy that had not let her go to Panama got up and said, "Well, are the women going to go?" And the battalion commander just looked at him and said, "Of course they're going to go. We're not combat ready without them." And that was the end of the discussion. So yeah,
Never want to tell a commander you're not combat ready.
that's right. So yeah, they're going. I don't care. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of times that whether it was the service members or Congress or said that women shouldn't be allowed. What was their reasoning? Was it they didn't think it was smart enough, or was it that the body couldn't handle it? What was their excuse for that?
You mean the initial why they passed the law? So I think it was all of those things. This was back in the 40s. And even though women had proved themselves during World War II that they could do just about any job, it was the 40s, quite frankly.
Like in the 90s, because you said you go through flight school, and I know you go through a lot of that physical training. So
Yeah.
I just was curious to see why in the 90s you still had folks in.
Oh yeah, no, there were still people that.
They just,
Yeah.
they didn't have, it'd be way simpler if there were those clear reasons that you're giving as reasons. And I think that's why it was bound to fall apart,
Yeah.
because they couldn't support opinions that
Yeah.
had no basis.
Yeah, by the 90s, really the only excuse they had left was, because they had seen women could do all of this stuff, obviously. By the 90s, the only excuse left was that they were worried that it would hurt unit cohesion.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And-
I served in the Navy, and we had I flew S3s, and I got to say that we had women in our squadron in 2001 to 2003, and unit cohesion was great with it.
Exactly, right. And that's what,
They were just squadron mates.
yeah.
They were aviators and all.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah. So,
We are functional.
that's right.
And we can multitask.
Yeah, as one F-16 pilot said to me while all this was going on, people bond. It's
Right.
yeah, it's not just men bonding with men and women bonding with women. So yeah. So.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for coming.